My name is Sharon Downs. I'm the director for the Disability Resource Center at University of Arkansas at Little Rock. And I'm very pleased to be here with you today to talk about diversity, universal design, and you. Let's begin by just covering generally what's going to be talked about. I'm going to talk about disability and what it is. You may think you know what it is, but I think maybe you have a different definition that you'll appreciate. Reframing disability, and we'll also talk quite a bit about universal design. So let's talk first of all about what is disability. This definition on the screen is an extremely common definition, and let me read it to you. Disability is an injury, illness, or congenital condition that causes or is likely to cause a loss or difference of physiological or psychological function. This is a very legalistic definition. You'll see this or something very similar to it in documents related to the government, EEOC, different agencies. I don't like this definition at all, which is why I have the big red X through it. To me, that's not what disability is. To me, that's what impairment is. An impairment is such a condition that causes a loss of function in one of those areas. So what is disability? Well, let's look at this definition. A loss or limitation of opportunities to take part in society on an equal level with others due to social and environmental barriers. Now, to me, that really does fit because of the work that we've been doing in my department related to disability and design. So if you play with the words a little, this to me also rings very true. Society creates social and environmental barriers which result in disability. So you can see from that framework, disability really is not so much about the person and the condition in which they have. It's much more the way our environments are designed that don't take everybody into account. So let's talk a little bit about reframing disability. This is my favorite graphic, but it's to help us all remember that we need to look at disability through a very different lens than we have in the past. If you think about the concept of diversity and all the things that come under diversity, then you think racial diversity, you think gender equality, you think religious diversity, that's gender identity, age, and so disability really is under that same umbrella. It's an aspect of diversity. But what does disability look like? Some of those other graphics give you an idea of what that looked like. This is what disability looks like. It looks like everybody. It looks like you and me. When I do this presentation to a classroom, I like to kind of look out and see how many people are in the room. If it's 100 people, then I'll tell them, look around. There are about 20% of you who have a disability of some type, statistically speaking. And so when you think of disability, it's not an us or them concept. And I think that's a very common mistake that a lot of people make. Because people feel like you belong in either one of two camps. You have a disability or you don't have a disability. But how I frame it is that you are in one of two camps, but it's a very different paradigm. You either have a disability or you're going to have a disability if you live long enough. So disability really does affect everybody, whether it's personal, yourself, or family, or friend, etc. So why is reframing disability so important? Why is accessibility so important? Well, I think what has happened is historically we have looked at disability as a compliance issue. There were laws set in place, the Americans with Disabilities Act, the Americans with Disabilities Act amendments, etc. So people look at it from, here's the law, let's be in compliance with that so that we don't have a complaint filed against us. And that really is an old way of thinking about disability. New thinking really is following the spirit of the law. And Congress's intent with the ADA was to level the playing field. It wasn't to help people know where the line was so that they could discriminate up until that line and not beyond. So really, ADA is civil rights legislation. It was modeled after the civil rights legislation in the 1960s. So when you think of it in those terms, how you approach disability looks very, very different. Let's talk about a few of those. This image is to symbolize the past. You know, I'm not down on the ADA at all. I'm very grateful it was passed. In 20 plus years it's been in existence. It has been a tremendous benefit to disabled people all around the country. But it was set in place to solve a problem. And that problem has not yet been solved. And I think part of the reason that problem has not been solved is because, again, people are looking very rigidly and very legalistically at what they have to do according to the law. This image to me represents where we're going as a field. And when I say field, I'm talking specifically about disability and higher education. This really to me symbolizes the future and what we would like to see prosper, and not to be looking back at old legislation that kind of boxes us in, but to look forward and expand our view of what we can do to make the environments in which students interact completely accessible. So typically, in a disability office, for instance, the very first question that the DS, the disability services provider, asks is, does the student have a disability? That's the question they want answered. Well, I'm going to posit to you that that is not the important question at all, and the ADA Amendments Act supports me entirely in this. The question is, what barriers is the student experiencing? That's really our call. That's what we're supposed to be doing in this field, identifying barriers that students are experiencing. So when our focus is there, it really is quite a different approach than the historical approach. When the barriers are identified, then of course our next step is to think about how can we remove those barriers. There are a couple of ways to remove barriers. One is through design, which we'll be talking quite a bit about, and the other is accommodation, which I think most people are very familiar with. Student comes into the DS office and they're not able to access a course or a building or a website, and our office puts accommodations in place so that they can access it just like every other student. But to me, that's a very reactive approach. You know, we're waiting for the problem to show up on our doorstep, and then we come up with a solution that fixes it for that student. The design approach is a much more proactive and sustainable approach. So what that focus is thinking about environments that students are going to interact within, and designing them from the ground up to be accessible so that accommodations are not even necessary. And that really is the focus of our department. And that's all about universal design. Our ultimate goal in our department is for students not to experience barriers related to their disability, for them to just access everything just like every other student does, just by showing up. And to have this kind of a feel in this image of it being open and welcoming and no barriers. Let me walk you through a couple of examples that kind of get you from the old thinking of accommodations to the new thinking of design, universal design. This is a ramp that was built after the fact for an older building. I'm not sure where this was taken, but as you can see, it does this zigzag to get access to the building. So somebody would have to enter from the bottom and go up and back and up and back and up to get to the building. This is obviously an afterthought. Somebody put up a building and then later thought, oops, people in wheelchairs need some way in this building. So they built this, and it's perfectly functional. It's not attractive. It's not elegant. I wouldn't want to attach to my house, but it does the job. If you look as things evolve, let's look at this building. This is the front of a building on our campus, Dickinson Hall, which is the building I'm in right now. You're probably into. When you approach the front of the building, there are two steps to enter the building. So if you're in a wheelchair or pushing a walker, or you're the UPS guy with a whole bunch of packages on a dolly, you're thinking, well, this isn't going to work for me at all. Well, as you can see over here on the side, there is an accessible entrance. It's separated from the other entrances, but it's still pretty easy to get to. So, and it was designed that way. The building was designed this way. So you don't have the ugly ramp attached to the building, but it's still not exactly right, I would say. I have a friend of mine who uses a wheelchair, and he says what this design does for him is it creates a social barrier. Because if they're approaching that building from the north and they get to that building, if he's with a group of friends, everybody enters through that way, and he has to peel off from the group and go around to the accessible door and hopefully hook back up with them. So he calls that a social barrier, and I think that's a really visceral thing that he experiences, that the designers of this building probably didn't give any thought to at all, because they're likely not wheelchair users. So yes, it gives access, but not quite there. Consider this building. I'm not sure where this is in another state. As you can see, the front of the building is a bank of glass doors Over here you've got an accessible door, and the approach as you go up to the building is a very gentle incline from street level, from the sidewalk level. So with this approach, everybody can access this going in the same way. There's no ugly ramp, there's no there's no kind of a separate location that people in wheelchairs have to go through. So to me, this design really does it. It does the universal design. Everybody can access it the same way. It's ready for anybody. If you're a wheelchair user or if you're a mom pushing your child in a stroller, it works for everybody. Let's translate that. Oh, I'm sorry. And so this is which one is good design. You know which one I'm going to say. Let's translate that to the web environment. This is a website, City of San Diego. It's a very visually attractive site. It's kind of busy for my taste, but it's attractive and it gets the job done. And when I accessed this, I was trying to see how a screen reader might access it. For anyone who's not familiar, screen reader is technology that is used by blind users, and it audibly reads to them what is on the page. And I had a feeling this one might not be designed well for a screen reader, and so I checked it, and I was right. It's completely not readable by a screen reader. So I did a Google search, and I found they had a text-only parallel site. And this actually was the norm 10 years, 15 years ago for websites. They would design their front website for everybody to access who could use their vision, and they would design a text-only website for blind users. I looked, the information on here was not exactly the same. It was mostly parallel, not exactly. So for a blind user, if they went on the old site, or the visual site, ideally they would have instructions immediately on their screen reader that would give them a hyperlink to the text-only page. They didn't even have that. I had to Google to find this. And I would say it's functional. People could use it, but it still has some problems. People can't access it the same way everybody else accesses. You get on that San Diego website, and if you're a screen reader user, all you get is junk. It reads just junk back to you. It doesn't even tell you how to get to this site. So you've got to really kind of work to find it. The other problem is, like I said, it's not an exact representation of what's on the original site, because one reason people went away from this model is because when you design your site and then have a text only, you have two jobs to do. You update it on one, and then you have to go to the text-only website and make updates. Well, what always happens, I won't even say almost always, what always happens is somebody forgets to update the text-only website. And so then that data is not updated, it's not as dynamic. And so the blind user, even if they can find that site, they're not getting the same experience at all. But it also misses the mark, in my mind, as far as other people who might want a text-only website. For instance, it's someone who has dyslexia. They want the screen reader to read it to them. But would you want to access this page visually if you're a sighted user who has dyslexia? No, absolutely not. You're going to want this page, the San Diego Bright Vivid page, because you can get all the visual information plus have it read to you. So that, to me, is the equivalent of the ugly ramp on the side. This is the next step in the evolution. This should look familiar to you all. It's the Health 101, Student Health 101 newsletter that all of our students get. Very visual. I personally don't like it. It's far too busy for me. But what it has is it has hidden instructions for JAWS users to tell them how to do things that are not intuitive. So they would get this message. A screen reader would open that flash site, and it would say, to access a text version, hit Control-Alt+4 on your keyboard. So it gets you there, yes, but you have to still go a different path than everybody else. The best design is building it accessible from the ground up, like that library. Of course, this is my website, so you know it's going to be completely accessible. But UALR has done a very nice job as far as adopting WordPress as our engine for running websites, and it's a very good tool as far as accessibility. So again, when you think of which one is good design, clearly it's going to be the one from UALR. So when you think of access and you think accommodations, here's a page that has typical accommodations in a college setting: taking notes, spoken lectures, etc., etc. For every one of these issues could be fixed entirely by a design change, and accommodations would not even be necessary. However, that requires input and work on the part of faculty who are involved in these classes, and not just the disability office. I know this looks like an amoeba, but this graphic I like a lot. The one on your left, to me, represents an old way of teaching. I like thinking of this in terms of teaching. So the red dots symbolize the very different ways that students are going to access information. And this is going to be students with or without disabilities, and, students who are here from another country, who are not native English speakers, everybody. Visual learners versus auditory learners versus kinesthetic. So you see the dots are all spread out, but the gray circle is very small. That represents how oftentimes faculty teach their classes. They teach like they were taught. Most professors don't go to school to learn how to be great teachers. So they teach the way they were taught, but look at all the ways that they're missing the mark for a lot of students. Whereas if you look at the one on the right, it really stretches that circle so that it encompasses more and more students. And the ones that are not in that amoeba shape, I think those would be well represented as far as we may actually need to put accommodations in place, like a sign language interpreter, for instance, a classic example. So I hope this has helped you kind of understand about what universal design is, how to look at disability in a way that is helpful to people who are in that community, and how to, maybe one day you're going to be faculty, how to teach your classes in such a way that you're reaching all of your students and not just the ones who learn like you learn. Thank you so much for your time and attention. Take care.